Today we're going to cover the process of putting a mini chest back together. It's going to require several boards, and we're going to be using some knotty alder for this process. And I don't have the dust collector on just because of the noise, so you're going to see some dust coming out, but it's not a big deal. I'll kind of try and keep the stuff out of my eyes. But the first process that we need to do is taking our standard 8, 10, or 12 foot board and cutting it down to a usable length. And we're going to keep everything 1 inch rough. And then after we glue the boards edge to edge, then we'll be able to trim it all square and get it to finished size. So our first step is right here at the radial arm saw with the long board. So I'm going to get some boards cut here to put our back together. So here we go. I've got my 3 boards here that I'm going to be putting together into my back, and it looks like I've got plenty here. I might need to put an additional piece in, but if I need to do that, I'll do that off camera. It's not going to be part of this process. So my first step is to take these boards over to the jointer and get one edge on each of these boards straight, clean, and square. So I'm going to readjust and get set up on the jointer next. Our next step for putting back together for the mini chest is to joint an edge on each of our boards. That's what I'm going to be doing here next. Just make sure that you're using push sticks if your boards are under 6 inches wide. All of these are under 6 inches wide, so I will be using push sticks on all of these. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the jointer and get an edge jointed on each of these boards. Just double checking to make sure that the edges are clean and they all look really good. So my next step is the table saw. I need to rip these to rough width as well, so that's where we're going to head next, is over to the table saw. The next step for putting our back together for the mini chest is to rip the width of all of my boards that I'm going to be putting together for my back to rough width. All that entails is taking each individual board, measuring the width at both ends and checking their width. I've got 4 5/16 there, and I've got 4 and just over a quarter there. This is my smallest measurement, so I'm going to take that measurement at 4 1/4 and I'm going to subtract 1/8 of an inch, and that's what I'll set my fence for. I'm going to be measuring each one individually. I'm really not sure if they're all going to be the same or not, so I always double check the width of all of the boards independently. Don't assume that they're all going to be the same. Just measure them all and get the maximum width that you can out of each one. So again, all I'm doing is I'm measuring the width, subtracting 1/8, and that's what I'm setting the fence for. In this case, my first board is going to be 4 1/8. So it's set for 4 1/8, and now I'm going to make my cuts. So I've got my boards ripped to rough width. My next step is I need to determine how my boards are going to be going together. So I'm going to set that up next, and I'll show you that process. So what I'm doing is I'm holding up the ends of the boards so that you can see what the growth rings look like. The growth rings determine how we put our wide panels together. What we want to do is we want to have the cupping of the end grain go opposite of each other. For instance, this one should be up, the middle one should be down, and this other side should be up. Now if you notice, it is really hard to tell what the grain or the growth rings are doing right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the miter saw, and I'm just going to very lightly trim the end off so that you can actually see the growth rings on the end grain. The main reason why you can't see it is due to the fact that the radial arm saw cuts so roughly. So I'm going to head over there right now, and I'm going to get the ends cut so we can see what's going on. Just so you can be able to see what the growth rings are doing. I'm not quite sure if the lighting is going to be able to pick it up or not. So I just used a Sharpie to highlight the cupping direction of the end grain of each board. So this is an example of how we would put this board or these three boards together to make a wide panel. Notice that the growth rings are cupping opposite of each other as you go across. We start going up, then down, then up. And as long as they're alternating up, down, that is all that matters for this process. So our next process is going to be to mark the face of the board using a pencil or a marker in this case so you can actually see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line across the board. This is called a witness mark. The witness mark indicates how these three boards are intended to go together. That way, if we mix them up, jumble them up, at the end of the period, if you get to this point and you're able to label everything and you run out of time, that way when you come back the next day or whenever over the weekend, you know exactly how these boards are going to go together. So there's my witness mark across the board, and then I'm going to label them across the joints towards away. So what that means is that I'm going to take this board and I'm going to joint this edge with that face. T means towards the fence of the jointer. I'm going to take this board, and when I joint this edge, this face is going to be away from the fence. With this edge, I'm going to put this face towards the fence of the jointer, and on this board, with this edge, I'm going to put that face away from the fence. So my hand is representing the fence of the jointer. So I'm going to go set back up over at the jointer, and we will make those passes really quick, and then we'll be able to glue this panel up. For this step, we're back at the jointer. We're going to be jointing those edges where the joints are going to be coming together. The two boards are going to be, or the three boards are going to be coming together edge to edge. And what I want you to do is to pay attention to the labels on the faces as I'm doing this, so that you understand what I'm looking at when I'm doing the jointing. I'm not going to be able to talk. The jointer is pretty loud, so I'm going to be firing it up, and I'll show you the end result after the shaping is done, or the jointing is done. right, I have my 3 boards. They're jointed and they should be good to go for gluing, but I always want to double check and make sure that my joints are nice and tight. I shouldn't see any gaps or anything. So I'm going to set them up right here on the end of the jointer, and I'll show you what the end result is and what I'm looking for. Okay, first of all, what I'm seeing is I'm looking at the end grain, up, down, up, so that's still good. And then I'm going to move the camera forward and see if I can get this a little bit broader here. It's not going to get the whole thing. Well, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for gaps. I'm looking at the joints and I'm looking the length of them. Now what I do see is there's a little bit of a, I don't know if you can see this, there is a little bit of a shadow line right here, but that's not an indication of a gap. That's just the boards are they're just a little bit offset, so there's a little bit of a shadow on it. But as I'm looking at this, I don't see any gaps through the entire length of this panel. So we should be good to go and be able to put this panel together and glue it up. So I'm going to go set up for gluing. I've got 3 I-bar clamps, a bottle of glue, a hammer, and a sheet of blue paper all laid out and ready to go. So let's go over and get this thing glued up. All right, as I stated before, I do have a sheet of blue paper. I've got 3 I-bar clamps. I've got a bottle of glue and a hammer. Now, just a little thing that you need to be aware of when you are setting these up is the gap between the end of the boards and the edge of the glue or the clamp itself. This should be no more than 2 inches. So if you are looking at this carefully, the edge of the clamp should be no more than 2 inches in from each end. Now I am very well within that range, but that is the absolute maximum that you can be in. You don't have to mark it like I just did. I'm just doing that as a reference so you can see what that looks like. I do like to keep it not as close as possible, but I do like to have it in just a little bit. The main thing that I need you to be aware of here is that I have clamps that are alternating top, bottom, top, bottom. So I've got my 2 clamps that are on the ends that are on the bottom. My 3rd clamp here is going to be placed on top in the middle, but only after I do my gluing. So just keep that in mind. Now I want you to take a look at this. I want you to see how many joints I have. I have 2 joints and 3 boards. So that means that I only need to put glue on 2 of the 3 boards because I have this one that's facing out and I don't need to put glue on that out-facing edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide them forward just a little bit so I have a little bit of room here to work with. I'm going to flip the 2 boards up that I know I need to put glue on, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to apply it. Now when I do this, I like to do wavy lines. This will actually allow me to put a little bit extra glue on there. If I just do a straight line, it's not going to put as much glue on there, and I need that extra little bit. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm not going to press. All I'm going to do, so I don't get glue on my palm, I'm just going to bring it up out of the way. I don't want to press down. I just want my finger to gently float along the top surface of that little bead of glue. And then I come back and I completely cover the entire edge with glue. And this is not something that you want left up to chance. This is something that you want to ensure is going to happen. So I always go back and I always spread this bead of glue over every edge that I glue together. So I'm going to quickly take care of this. Now just remember when you're doing this, you've got about 5 to 8 minutes worth of time to get this clamped. It's pretty simple to do it. When you have wider panels, that can be a little bit more tricky. The glue that I have left on my finger, I'm just going to wipe it off right on the corner, and then if there is anything residual, just use the blue paper, because that's one of the reasons why it's there. Now I'm going to drop my boards down into position and bring them up to the clamps. Bring up the clamp heads. And then put my 3rd clamp on top in the middle. Now when it comes to these clamps, sometimes these things can get really sticky, and oftentimes your hands can't break them loose. So just one really simple trick is just to knock this black part right on the edge of the workbench, just like so, and that will help make it a little bit easier to open the clamps up. I'm going to drop this clamp into position. Now I want you to look at the edges with me. Just notice that they're not perfectly even, but you need to realize that these boards are still rough. They're still an inch long. They're an inch longer than finished length. So don't worry about making these ends perfect, because at this point, at this stage, it's not necessary, it's not required at all. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to snug. I'm going to lightly clamp my boards together, and I want you to notice there is glue squeezing out of the joint, and that's a good sign. Now, with a little bit of clamp pressure on there, I want to use the hammer, and I'm going to tap down the four corners so that the boards are touching the clamps, the bars of the clamps. I'm going to tap it, and now I'm going to tighten them up. I'm using both hands, but I'm not going crazy. I'm just making them nice and tight. The last thing that you need to do is put your name on it. Once you have your name on your panel and all of the clamps on, you can go ahead and put your panel over here up against the wall to dry, and then put your sheet of blue paper, the hammer, and the glue bottle away, and you are ready for this to dry. And at this stage, you're just going to be waiting for this to dry, and the other three panels, your front, your two sides, and your back, before moving on to the sanding stage on the wide belt sander. So we're going to wait for this to dry, and then our next step is sanding everything down to finished thickness.